Recently, in our adult Bible study, we worked our way through the book of Judges, which by any account is a depressing read. It is the dark ages of Israel's history. But it is not the only book of the Bible that takes place during the period that's described there in Judges. There is another book that has a much different feel that I thought would be good for us to think about this morning, particularly as we gather around the table today. So I would like for you to turn with me to the next book of the Bible after the book of Judges, which is the book of Ruth. In contrast to what we read in the book of Judges, stories of tribal conflict, of gross immorality, of compromise with paganism, the story here in Ruth is a story that will teach us about the redeeming work of Christ himself. So look with me in verse 1. It says in Ruth 1, verse 1, "In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land." Now we know from previous studies, books like Deuteronomy, that the Lord told Israel, warned Israel, that if you are unfaithful to the covenant, there will be consequences. One of those consequences that he lists for them is the possibility of famine. So given what we know about the spiritual state of the nation and the time of Judges, it's not a huge shock that they are experiencing what's described here in verse 1. It also says that there was a man of Bethlehem in Judah who went to sojourn in the country of Moab. Like many characters in the Bible story who during times of famine travel elsewhere to find food, this man does with his wife and sons. Verse 2 says the name of this man was Elimelech, which means that God is the king. If only Israel had really acted like that during the time of the judges. The name of his wife, Naomi, which means sweetness. And in fact, in a lot of ways, the story of this book revolves around the change in Naomi, who's described for us here in a sweet time in life, and then whose life becomes bitter, and then eventually becomes sweet once again. The names of his two sons were Mahlon and Chilion. These names are interesting and peculiar. Mahlon means sickly. Chilion means frail. Perhaps these boys were undersized when they were born. Given what happens to them, frequently I talk about possible baby names from the Bible. I would eliminate these two from the list as not great candidates. It says in verse 2 that they went into the country of Moab and remained there. But instead of finding relief, the family encounters deepening tragedy. It says in verse 3 that Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died. The passing of a spouse is tragic in any culture, but in the ancient world it was even more burdensome because widows had such little standing legally and culturally. The only thing keeping Naomi from total disaster is that she does have two sons who marry Moabite girls in verse 4. The name of the one was Orpah and the name of the other Ruth. But then 10 years later, disaster strikes again. They lived there 10 years, and verse 5 says, both Mahlon and Chilion died, so that the woman was left without her two sons and her husband. The only thing worse than being a widow in the ancient world was to be a widow and childless. And now she has left Israel with a husband and two sons and finds herself in a foreign country, and all that she has to show for it is these two Moabite girls. So Naomi decides to return home. And she tells the daughters they should remain in Moab, so that you can marry Moabite men. But the girls object. And so once again she tells them, look, you need to stay here. I have no more sons to give you, and you couldn't wait long enough for me to have sons to give to you. And Orpah decides to leave her mother-in-law. But the end of verse 14 says, Ruth clung to her. And when Naomi once more tries to convince Ruth, you need to stay here, Ruth says in verse 16, do not urge me to leave you or return from following you. For where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die. There will I be buried. May the Lord do so to me and more also, if anything but death parts me from you. Some of you may have had those verses read at your wedding. They're beautiful verses that express commitment. So Naomi, with Ruth, returns to Bethlehem. Their presence causes a stir, the text says in verse 19. You can imagine why. Think about how different Naomi must have looked after the hardships that she has experienced over the last several years. And it says in verse 20 that she says to them, "Do not call me Naomi, call me Mara." You'll remember the story of Israel and the bitter waters, which are named Mara. That's what this word means, bitterness. "For the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me?" Now you might be thinking, I thought you said this was going to be different. This is pretty depressing, just like Judges was. But chapter 2 and verse 1 introduces a new character, a man of character. Verse 1 says, "Now Naomi had a relative of her husband's, a worthy man of the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz." He's a wealthy man, a landowner. It just so happens, according to verse 3, that Ruth goes to glean in his field, doing what the law of Moses permitted the poor to do. When Boaz learns who she is, he grants her special privileges. And in chapter 2 and verse 11, he explains why. Boaz answered her, "All that you've done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me, and how you left your father and mother and your native land and came to a people that you did not know before. The Lord repay you for what you've done, and a full reward be given you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." Now, when Ruth returns home and tells Naomi about these events that have transpired, we learn an additional detail about this man Boaz. Look in chapter 2 and verse 20. "Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, 'May he be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead.' Naomi also said to her, 'The man is a close relative of ours, one of our redeemers.'" Under the law of Moses, the land that you lived on as an Israelite belonged to God, and under normal circumstances, you were not permitted to sell it. But if you encountered dire poverty, you were permitted to sell the land, or even, if necessary, to sell yourself into slavery. But it was the responsibility of your next of kin to be what this passage describes as your redeemer. They were to pay the money off to take care of the debt, either of the land that you've sold or even of the slavery in which you have indentured yourself, if there is a redeemer who has the resources to do so. If not, there were other provisions in the law. Also in the law of Moses, there was a provision that said that if a man dies and he leaves his wife a widow and he has a brother, that brother should marry her so that the family name and inheritance could be perpetuated. So what we have just learned here is that such a redeemer exists for Naomi and for Ruth. It is this man Boaz who could be the redeemer, which explains what happens in the next chapter in verse 7. "At night, when Boaz had eaten and drunk, and his heart was merry, he went to lie down at the end of the heap of grain, and then Ruth came softly and uncovered his feet and lay down. At midnight, the man was startled and turned over, and behold, a woman lay at his feet." I would have been startled too, particularly because this is the ancient way for a woman to pop the question to a man. And essentially that's what Ruth does here. She asks Boaz to marry her. And he wants to, except there's a plot twist. Look at verse 12. "Now it is true that I am a redeemer, yet there is a redeemer nearer than I." Yes, he is a redeemer, but he's not the closest in kin to Naomi and to Ruth. "Remain tonight, and in the morning, if he will redeem you, good, let him do it. But if he's not willing to redeem you, then as the Lord lives, I will redeem you. Lie down until the morning." So the next morning, Boaz goes to the gate of the city where business was taken care of to settle affairs with this potential rival. Chapter 4, verse 1. Now Boaz had gone up to the gate and sat down there, and behold, the Redeemer, of whom Boaz had spoken, came by. Now Boaz explains the situation, that Naomi has returned. Apparently Elimelech had indeed sold property that now needs to be redeemed. And he explains to this closer Redeemer that you now have the opportunity to redeem this property. And if you look carefully, at the end of verse 4, we see a disturbing answer by this man. Sounds good to me. I will redeem it. Is this going to derail the whole plan? But then look at verse 5. Then Boaz said, the day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the widow of the dead, in order to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance. If you take on the responsibility as a redeemer, you will also take on a wife, and it will be your responsibility to give her children so that those children can have the inheritance. Which means that this redeemer will not himself stand to profit by what he does. Those profits are going to go to Ruth's children. And so in verse 6, the Redeemer said, I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I impair my own inheritance. Take my right of redemption yourself, for I cannot redeem it. I'll tell you a funny detail in this text that some commentators that I read point out. This other guy, this other Redeemer, is never named. In Hebrew, he is called Poloni Almoni, which would be the English way of saying so-and-so. He's just a so-and-so. He doesn't deserve even to be named. And if you think about it, by refusing to marry Ruth, he is refusing to do what Boaz said, which is, in verse 5, perpetuate the name of the dead. And now this man who refuses to perpetuate the name of the dead is remembered to us in the anonymity he so richly deserves. So then, this clears the way for Boaz to be the Redeemer, to marry Ruth, and to give her and to give Naomi children. Look in verse 13. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. And he went into her, and the Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son. Then the women said to Naomi, Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without a redeemer, and may his name be renowned in Israel. Now I want you to think about what we've just read this morning. We have read the story of a redeemer who is from Bethlehem. It's the story of a redeemer from Bethlehem who delivers those who are in debt. And he delivers them from their debt by his grace. It is a redeemer from Bethlehem who delivers those in debt, and in so doing transforms what begins as a story of death and loss into a story of life and blessings. And it is a redeemer who is willing to do so and to embrace those that he redeems as part of his own family. Which of course means that what we have just read is in fact the story of Jesus himself. And the story of what Jesus has done for all of us. Jesus is the ultimate redeemer who is born in Bethlehem. He is the redeemer who delivers those who are in debt by his grace. He is the redeemer who transforms a story of death and loss, both his own death, but more importantly for us, our spiritual death, into a story of life and blessings. And Jesus is the redeemer who is willing to embrace those he redeems as part of his own family. And it just happens to be the case that Boaz the Redeemer is an ancestor of Jesus the Redeemer. Look at the rest of the story in verse 17. And the women of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, a son has been born to Naomi. They named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. And you, of course, know that in Matthew's genealogy of Jesus, not only is Obed mentioned by name, but also Boaz and Ruth are mentioned by name as well. You could say that Boaz was the Redeemer's Redeemer, in the sense that Boaz redeemed Ruth and her family, and therefore played a role in the coming of Jesus as our Redeemer. But of course, on a deeper level, we recognize that Jesus is the Redeemer's Redeemer. That Jesus came to redeem Boaz, and to redeem Ruth, and to redeem Naomi, and to redeem us. With one big difference from Boaz. Jesus chose to redeem us, not because he recognized in us such worthy and excellent character as Ruth, a woman of virtue. Jesus redeemed us even when we were dead in our sins, even when we were spiritually bankrupt. And unlike in the case of Boaz, where those who needed to be redeemed took the initiative, Naomi says to Ruth, hey, go and lay at his feet during the night. Jesus, our ultimate Redeemer, took the initiative for us. He came to us. He became one of us. And in our case, the price that was needed for our redemption was not measured in money, but in blood. In the perfect obedience of Jesus, even in the face of excruciating suffering, in the death of our Redeemer. And unlike in the story of Ruth, whose Redeemer drew some benefit by redeeming her, I mean, after all, he got a wife and he got children. What could any of us possibly give to Jesus to improve his life? There's a line in Rock of Ages, in my hand no price I bring, simply to thy cross I cling. And so today we celebrate the Redeemer's Redeemer. We celebrate our Redeemer. And unlike the nameless rival of Boaz, who chose not to redeem Ruth because it would be too costly for him, force him to share his inheritance, our Redeemer eagerly came to redeem us so that he could share his inheritance with us, so that our lives would not be Mara, but Naomi, not bitter, but sweet. So as we take the bread and cup today, these words take on new meaning for us. Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without a Redeemer, and may his name be renowned.
Before we partake, we ask that you would take both emblems. We're going to pass the trays out once. And as we go through the Lord's Supper, I ask that you would meditate on Christ at this time.